This lecture is on interrogation and confession. Now, for part of this lecture, what I have you do is watch a frontline program on the confessions about the Navy sailors that confessed to the crime that they didn't commit. So if you haven't watched that, make sure you do go and watch that. The links are online in your course. It's an excellent program. So a lot of times people have misconceptions about what police can actually do, what the point of an interrogation is, and what if confession is actually the goal. So the importance of a confession is paramount in a defendant's trial. So the most damaging evidence in a case is a confession. And that just kind of makes sense. So what we must understand and we must consider are the circumstances under which the confessions were obtained. Most people don't think that someone would falsely confess to committing a crime, but think about yourself. Are there any conditions in which you would just confess in order to have an interrogation end? And what we've seen in that video and in real life is some people are more susceptible than others to interrogation techniques and ultimately falsely confessing to committing crimes. But in order for a confession to be valid, in my opinion, or in order for it to be technically admissible in a court, the confession should not be coerced. It, in fact, should be voluntary, voluntarily given. But think about what you know of the interrogation process. Does that make the confession voluntary? So in this class and in the textbook, we talk a lot about the Paul Ingram case. And this is a fascinating case. So Paul Ingram was charged with sexual abuse, of raping his own daughters, participating in hundreds of satanic cult rituals that included slaughtering 25 babies. These were some pretty serious charges. But who was Paul Ingram? So in 1988, when these charges were filed, Paul Ingram had been a sheriff's deputy for almost 17 years in Washington. He was married, had 5 kids, he was active in his church, and he worked extensively with schools warning children about the dangers of drugs. But at the time, his daughter, whose name was Erica, she was 22. She made charges in 1988 while she was at a summer camp where she was a counselor. Later, she was talking to the police about the allegations of the abuse, and they started to build in how extreme they were. She said that she had caught a disease from her father, like an STD, that he had sacrificed babies, and all this ridiculous stuff. And at some point, his other daughter, named Julie, joined in the accusations. And the stories kept changing from the girls. It was weird. I mean, simply, it was weird. And it was shocking and horrifying. And, you know, I'm not here to question these girls and their reports, but something wasn't right. So during the interrogation process, despite being a law enforcement officer, Paul Ingram had no experience with interrogations whatsoever. At first, he denied any knowledge of the claims. And then they used hypnotism. He was hypnotized and given graphic details about the alleged crimes that he committed. When he could later not remember any details of anything that happened, he was told by a forensic psychologist that sex offenders often repress memories of their offenses because they were too horrible for them to acknowledge. That's a very Freudian notion. And his pastor of his church urged him to confess, told him that they were probably true because children do not make up such things. Even when he couldn't remember any of it, Ingram said, "If this did happen, We need to take care of it. So it wasn't like he was admitting to the crime. The police and the psychologists used leading questions and tried to get Ingram to visualize scenes involving group rapes, satanic cult activities, all this stuff. He eventually told police that he believed it had happened and that he must have psychologically repressed his memories of this happening. Part of his reasoning was he said that my girls know me, they wouldn't lie about something like this, so he trusted his children so much. And then later he was able to visualize scenes of the crimes, and he did confess, but in a really weird way. He would describe events like, I would have done this, instead of saying like, I actually did this. So there was this fellow named Richard Offshee who was originally called in by the prosecution, but he later came to believe that after interviewing Ingram, that through hypnosis, that Paul Ingram had actually been brainwashed into believing that he'd been part of a satanic cult. And Offshee decided to try an experiment with Ingram. He suggested that he would tell Ingram that he'd force one of his sons and one of his daughters to have sex with each other, like incest, right in front of him, which no one had ever accused him of. After repeated questions by Offshee, Ingram eventually began to remember and acknowledge that he'd done that too. He confessed to that crime. He even prepared a detailed 3-page written description of the incestuous acts which he forced his children into, which the guy had just totally made up. So Offshee began to doubt that Ingram was guilty of anything except being a highly suggestible individual. And some people are highly suggestible, like the guy in that video that you watched. Which one of those fellas from the Navy was highly suggestible? So Offshee began to advocate for Ingram's innocence, although it was too late for Paul Ingram to retract his confession. Finally, he was released on April 8th of 2003, but he'd served 15 years in prison. There was never any physical evidence that he was a Satan worshiper or part of a cult or a child abuser at all. This is a fascinating case about interrogation and confession, and here we have an actual police officer that becomes susceptible to the interrogation procedures and falsely confesses to ridiculous crimes. And he spent a good deal of his life in prison. So during the interrogation process, he was jailed for 5 months. He was interrogated 23 separate times. And eventually he pled guilty. And he had a plea bargain to 6 counts of 3rd-degree rape. Sentenced to 20 years in prison, with possibility of parole after 12 years. So what can a forensic psychologist do? Can you go in and do the interrogation? No, but you could probably educate police officers about the possibility of police eliciting false confessions, and you could change the procedures that are used in police departments to help protect against false confessions. You could act as an expert witness in a court, or you could be the author of an amicus brief describing some of the phenomena that we talked about today.